So here's a question that still echoes today. What drove South Carolina, a state that maybe seemed unlikely to become the very center of America's deadliest conflict?
And maybe even harder to grasp, what led Americans to seriously imagine killing each other on such a massive scale.
Exactly. Today we're going to try and unpack some of the core reasons, the foundational pieces that led us to that point. We're drawing on historical documents, firsthand accounts from the time.
Yeah, and understanding this period, it really means wading through a lot of information, different viewpoints,
Yeah.
It's complex.
It definitely is. And speaking of approaches to complex topics, you might find Mindful Moments interesting. It's a YouTube channel using AI for book analysis. Their focus on reflection and critical thinking kind of aligns with trying to get a handle on this history.
Interesting. Well, getting back to South Carolina,
Mm-hmm.
after the federal government banned the international slave trade, Charleston, it pretty much became the hub for the domestic trade.
The main engine, really.
Absolutely. A brutal engine for its economy. And by 1860, the numbers were, well, staggering. South Carolina had this incredibly high concentration of enslaved people.
How high are we talking?
Think about this. In just one district, you had 440 planters who each held over 100 people captive. The national average slaveholding household, just over 10.
Wow, that's a huge difference.
It is. Across the whole South, you had about 3.95 million people enslaved. And in South Carolina, one family, the Haywards, descendants owned over 3,000 human beings.
3,000 people, it's hard to even comprehend that number. It says so much about the power structure.
It really does. It was almost feudal, this level of control and wealth, and it completely shaped the social fabric, the politics, everything in South Carolina.
And this planter class, they had a particular view of themselves, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. They called themselves the chivalry. James Henry Hammond, one of the big planters there, actually said they were the nearest to noblemen of any possible in America.
American noblemen.
That's how they saw it, this idea of honor, nobility. But it was completely tied up with being slaveholders, with this paternalistic but ultimately brutal control.
But underneath that self-image, there must have been fear.
A deep, profound fear, especially of slave rebellion. Look at the 1860 census. South Carolina had 111,000 more enslaved people than white residents.
That's a massive imbalance.
And a perilous one. You saw it right in Charleston, too. Free and enslaved black people made up over 40% of the population. That made white residents incredibly uneasy.
I can imagine. How did that fear show up in everyday life?
You could see it physically.
Yeah.
Rich planters often built their homes almost like forts. Lots of outbuildings, kitchens, stables, slave quarters, all enclosed by these high walls.
To keep people in and danger out.
Exactly. Minimize risk. And the mechanics of the trade itself, right there in Charleston,
Yeah.
places like Ryan's Mart were central. It was just commerce and human lives.
Can you give us an example?
Sure, there's a sale, January 9, 1860. A flyer advertised a prime gang of 235 Negroes from General James Gadsden's estate.
A prime gang. Horrific language.
It is. And the terms. Half cash up front. The other half secured by a bond, due in 12 months. Essentially, the enslaved people were the guarantee for the final payment.
They were the collateral.
Precisely. The flyers listed everything. Names, ages, family connections, skills, physical conditions. You'd see Chloe, an 8-month-old infant. Aesop, just 5 months old. Often notes about who their mother was.
And skills, too.
Oh, yeah. Tom the Cooper, cooks, wheelwrights, but also descriptions like dropsicle. That's an old term for swelling, or even idiotic.
Yeah.
It was all laid out.
And the financial side must have been enormous.
Immense. Just 64 of Hammond's enslaved workers, if they fell into valuable categories, could be worth over $3 million in today's money. A massive investment.
So while this system is digging its heels in deeper in the South, what's happening up north, especially around Lincoln's election?
Right, a totally different scene. Election day in Springfield, Illinois, Lincoln's home base, was described as this big outdoor tumult. People were excited, rushing to vote. Republican women even put on a big feast.
Celebration.
Yeah, and Lincoln himself had this analogy for elections. He called them big boils. Painful before they burst, he said. But afterward, the body politic felt healthier.
Interesting take. Did it feel healthier after his election?
Well, in Springfield, there were huge celebrations, crowds out late into the night. But nationally, the country was fractured deeply. Lincoln got the biggest share of the popular vote for any president up to that point, but that was still only about 40% because it was a four-way race.
And in the South?
Practically nothing. Negligible support. In Virginia and Kentucky, his own birth state, he got barely over 1% of the vote.
Wow. That really highlights the divide. But even within the South, not everyone thought exactly alike, right? Like Major Robert Anderson.
That's a great point. Anderson, the Union guy in charge at Fort Sumter, later on, he actually had some personal sympathy for the South side in the whole sectional argument. But he also wrote about losing all sympathy with the people who govern this state, meaning South Carolina. He saw they were absolutely determined to, quote, cement their secession with blood.
So conflicted.
Very. And despite seeing their bloody intentions, Anderson, being from Kentucky, pretty much accepted the pro-slavery thinking of the time. He used derogatory terms for enslaved people, believed the Bible permitted slavery. It shows how complex and frankly contradictory people's views could be.
It really does. And the power of stories, of narrative, in shaping those views was huge back then. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin is maybe the biggest example. And just a reminder, exploring how stories shape history is something you can also delve into with resources like Mindful Moments and our podcasts.
Oh, Uncle Tom's Cabin had a massive impact. It started as a serial in a newspaper in 1851.
And it just took off.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because it portrayed the brutality of slavery so vividly. The family separations, the violence. Things many Northerners maybe hadn't fully visualized.
How did the South react?
Fiercely. Hostile doesn't even begin to cover it. Louisa McCord, a Southern writer, called it one mass of fanatical bitterness and foul misrepresentation wrapped in the garb of Christian charity.
Strong words.
And it was dangerous to even have the book in the South, not just for Southerners, but for visiting Northerners, too. Stowe herself, viciously attacked. One editor wanted a review that would destroy the reputation of the vile wretch in petticoats who could write such a volume.
Vile wretch in petticoats. Wow. What made the book so effective, do you think?
Stowe was brilliant at using sentimentalism. She created characters that readers, especially Northern readers, could relate to, could feel for. It humanized the enslaved in a way that directly countered the dehumanizing narratives pushed in the South.
It's fascinating how the personal and political were so tightly woven together then. James Henry Hammond, who you mentioned earlier, seems like a prime example of that.
Hammond embodies so much of it. Huge ambition. His dad apparently predicted he'd be president, went to South Carolina College, rose through the political ranks.
But his personal life, especially regarding slavery.
Deeply contradictory.
Yeah.
And disturbing. On his plantations, the labor was brutal, death rates were high. Yet, in his diary, he'd record these deaths, fret about the financial loss, but also express anxiety about their well-being as property, mostly. He even called himself a monster of inhumanity in his diary while still overseeing the system.
A monster who saw them as assets.
Right. And his ambition took him to Washington, D.C., where the slave trade was just operating openly. Meanwhile, you have the abolitionist movement growing in the North. William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator newspaper, for example. And the South was terrified this would spark more rebellions, like Nat Turner's revolt.
Did Hammond stay in politics continuously?
He had setbacks. There was a huge scandal involving affairs with his nieces, which forced him out of public life for a while. He did a grand tour of Europe, kind of retreated.
But he came back.
Oh, yes. Built a grand house in Columbia, South Carolina. A city, by the way, with almost as many black residents as white, which led to, you guessed it, stricter racial controls.
And he became known for a particular speech, right?
His infamous Mudsills speech. He argued that every society needed a class to do the menial labor, the mudsills, so that a higher class could pursue civilization. And he argued black enslaved people naturally filled that role.
How was that received?
Lauded in the South, of course, viciously condemned in the North. It laid bare the pro-slavery argument. Hammond also pushed the idea that cotton is king.
Ah, the economic argument.
Exactly. That the Southern economy, fueled by cotton and slave labor, was indispensable to the world. This idea unfortunately helped blind many Southern radicals. They seriously underestimated the North's industrial strength and his will to fight if the South actually tried to leave. They didn't think a real war was likely or that it would last long.
Believing their own narrative too strongly, was there anyone even more extreme than Hammond?
You could certainly argue Edmund Ruffin was, another Virginian from the planter elite. Initially, he was focused on farming reform using marl, a type of soil deposit, to improve exhausted land.
So an agriculturalist first.
Yeah. But he became friends with Hammond and really admired South Carolina's radical secessionist vibe.
What pushed him further?
John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry really solidified things for many Southerners, including Ruffin. It amplified fears about, as they put it, the demoralization of enslaved black people, led to even tighter controls, paranoia about black people dressing well or reading anti-slavery papers.
And Ruffin's reaction?
He went full throttle. He even wrote this fictional prophecy predicting total economic chaos and violence in the North if they lost southern markets. Just pure, extreme secessionist fire.
It's chilling seeing these views harden, and
Yeah.
all this is happening against a backdrop of, well, attempted normalcy, summer resorts and such.
Right. The southern elite still gathered at places like the Virginia Springs, social hubs, but you can bet the tension was simmering just beneath the surface. And then you have President Buchanan presiding over all this.
What was his take? He wasn't pro-slavery, was he?
Personally, he called slavery a moral evil, but his policy was strict non-interference. He really hoped the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision, which denied citizenship to black people and invalidated the Missouri Compromise, would just end the debate, settle it legally.
Wishful thinking.
Completely. In his inaugural address, he basically said he hoped everyone could just move on to more pressing and practical issues. Meanwhile, Mary Chesnut, the famous diarist, initially loved Washington society, but later wrote about the saddest pall over the South and her boredom on the plantation.
And Buchanan himself wasn't seen as a strong leader.
He got nicknamed Aunt Fancy, which tells you something about the perception of indecisiveness. His core belief was that the crisis would resolve if the North just let the South alone to manage its own domestic institutions.
Which obviously wasn't going to happen.
No. And his inaction led to key figures resigning from his cabinet, like Howell Cobb and Lewis Cass. They saw secession happening and felt Buchanan wasn't doing nearly enough.
Wasn't there some kind of deal about the forts in Charleston?
An informal one, yeah. Between Buchanan and South Carolina congressmen, basically.
Mm-hmm.
We won't attack the federal forts in the harbor if you don't send reinforcements. A very fragile truce.
But the underlying feeling
Was hatred. Pure and simple. On the southern side towards the Union, a South Carolinian named Crawford wrote, flat out, "Let me assure you that this state is in revolution. I never in my life believed that such hatred could be exhibited to the Union."
revolution and hatred, a stark endpoint for this part of the story, this whole period leading up to the war. It really was such a tangled mess of money, social structures, deeply, deeply held beliefs.
Absolutely. And looking back, really listening to the words of people from that time, reading their accounts, it's crucial for understanding how this immense tragedy unfolded.
It makes you think, doesn't it? How powerful can these deeply ingrained social systems, these economic structures, be in shaping how entire populations see the world, how they shape national destiny?
Then maybe, what parallels could we draw carefully to our own time? It's something to ponder.
Definitely something to ponder. If you found this exploration valuable, we hope you'll subscribe and maybe share it with others who are interested. You can find links to related materials, including the book we've been drawing from, in the show notes.
And perhaps most importantly, just keep thinking critically about the information you encounter wherever you find it.